For the king who once fed the gods with promises had begun to hear their hunger return. The earth was cracking. The children's cries had turned to whispers. And deep beneath the market square, the stone that made a vow was waking again. Come closer, child of Africa. Sit by the firelight, for under this moon, every tale breathes again. You are welcome to Moonlight Tales of Africa. In the days when the world still moved with the breath of the spirits, when the waters of the river Niger were clear as truth, and trade canoe drifted like dreams between Anyoma and Onitsha, there was once a people who had no home. They were wanderers, tired faces, hungry eyes, carrying the bones of their ancestors in calabashes, seeking a land that would finally call it its own. They had been driven by war in one land, sickness in another, and famine in yet another. Each time they settled, death followed behind them like a shadow that refused to sleep. In one land, their farms withered before the harvest moon. In another, wild beasts prowled the night, taking their children one by one. When they sought refuge in the northern plains, the rulers there rose against them, calling them cursed. So they moved again, from the east to the south, weary feet upon weary ground. Among them was a man named Obieze, the son of a warrior and the bearer of an ancient stone. It was said that the stone came from a forgotten river shrine, and that whoever held it could speak to the spirits of direction. Obieze was a quiet man, strong in thought but broken in heart. One night, as his people lay in the cold, crying from hunger and despair, he walked into the forest alone and knelt before that stone. His tears fell like rain. He prayed not for himself, but for his people. He said, "O stone that sees the heart of the earth, if you lead us to a land that will feed our children, a land where the wind is soft and the soil is kind, I will give you the first fruit of every womb. Every first cry shall return to you as a covenant between life and peace." The night answered with silence. But the next morning, a dove landed upon the stone, and when it flew, Obieze followed. The people followed him too, and after many days, they reached the valley where no man lived, a wide plain surrounded by tall trees and cool waters. They called it Olu-Udo, the land of peace. In the early season, the land thrummed like a living drum. The air carried songs from dawn till moonrise. Children chased the dust of cattle through the fields. The river laughed against the banks, and every evening, the golden smoke of cooking fires curled into the sky like prayers. The king, Eze Obieze, would sit before the great courtyard, watching his people with quiet pride. He thought the gods had finally smiled upon his house, a house that once bled, now reborn in peace. But peace, my child, is a seed that must be watered carefully, for even the sweetest rain can drown it. At first, visitors came by the dozen, men from Ida with brass bracelets and coral beads, women from Onitsha with baskets of salt and pepper, hunters from Arochukwu who carried dried leopard skins and tales of the far forests. Their voices filled the market square, their laughter echoed through the narrow paths, and their songs mingled with those of the town's griots. Olu-Udo was a kingdom of color. Red cloths on washing lines, purple dyes spilling from the hands of dyers, children pounding yam beside singing mothers. There was no space for fear, only trade,
dance, and stories. Then, one morning, a trader's wife from across the river refused to enter the market. She said her first son had fallen ill after touching the market stream. The people of Olu-Udo murmured, but the priest assured her it was a coincidence. The next moon, a hunter from the north buried his daughter who had sipped water from the same stream. And then, a young bride, heavy with her first child, collapsed near the stone in the market square, and her unborn son was never born. The whispers began softly, like dry leaves brushing against the wall. But whispers are dangerous. They multiply faster than truth can follow. Soon, the traders began to leave before nightfall. They sold their goods at half price, packed their wares, and crossed the river with hurried steps. Even the drummers noticed. Their rhythms lost their laughter. Their beats sounded hollow, like footsteps echoing inside an empty house. Still, Eze Obieze refused to believe it was a curse. He sent for his chiefs to calm the market, to assure the traders that Olu-Udo was safe. He ordered that the market stream be purified, goats sacrificed, kola broken, prayers chanted through the night. But the morning after, the goats were found dead, their eyes open and pale like broken shells. That was when the other kingdoms began to notice. Messengers from Ida, Arochukwu, and Nteji came, bringing kola nuts and talk of alliances. Eze Obieze welcomed them with feasts and dancing. He dressed in white robes embroidered with golden threads and poured palm wine for his guests himself. But before the third night of the feast, thunder struck the courtyard, splitting the royal drum in two. The guests fled before dawn, leaving their kola nuts untouched. The king was a man of easy fear. He sent for his diviners, his priests, his elders, and together they burned incense and cast cowries on the palace floor. The cowries spoke of debts unpaid, of promises bound by blood and silence. They said the stone had been fed what it could no longer digest. But none dared to speak the king's name beside the word vow. So life continued, or at least what looked like life. The women still went to the stream, but they no longer lingered. The men still went to their farms, but they spoke to no one. The laughter of children grew smaller each day, until even the birds began to avoid the market square. And yet, the kingdom grew richer. Trade never fully stopped.
At night, when the moon touched the cracked stone in the market square, the wind carried a sound like a sigh, as if something beneath it was still awake, waiting, hungry. And Eze Obieze, once the proudest of kings, would stand alone on his balcony, whispering to the stone from afar, "I gave you peace. Why won't you give me rest?" The stone, of course, never answered. But the next morning, the river ran slower than before, and the priests began to speak of omens again. And that, my child, was the season when even the gods began to look away.
The season turned. The wind that once carried songs from the farms now blew with sorrow. Olu-Udo, once the land of laughter, had become a land of whispers. It began slowly, a baby coughing in the night, a mother's voice breaking through silence, a father's footsteps pacing the ground till dawn. Then one by one, the cries faded. By morning, the markets were quiet. The scent of pepper and palm oil no longer filled the air. Instead, there were the faint echoes of mothers wailing into the wind, a sound that made even the trees seem to mourn. In the evenings, the women gathered by the river, their wrappers soaked in tears, washing tiny cloths that would never be worn again. They sang songs not of joy, but of pain. Songs that rose and broke like waves upon the shore. Why do our wombs bring forth sorrow, they cried. Why does the earth take what it gives? Even the old midwives began to fear their own hands. No one wanted to help a woman deliver. It was said that the cry of a newborn carried a curse, that every first cry summoned the spirit of the vow. And still, they obeyed. They dug small graves by the mango trees. Fathers walked with trembling hands, covering the earth with sand and silence. Rumors spread like smoke. The people said, "The king has sold us. The gods have turned their back on us." Some whispered that each time a child died, a new gold ornament appeared in the king's courtyard. Others swore they had seen a messenger from the palace near the river shrine, carrying white fowls and bowls of palm oil in the night. One night, the wailing grew louder than ever. It came from the house of Chief Umenka, one of the king's closest councilmen. His wife, Adaku, had been barren since the days of their wandering, her face known by all, her sorrow a wound that never healed. But after 20 long years, her belly had finally swollen with life. When the child came, the moon was bright, and the air smelled of new rain. The baby's cry pierced the night, strong and clear. Adaku screamed with joy. She called out, "The gods have remembered me." But when Umenka looked into her eyes, he saw fear buried beneath her happiness. He knew what must come. He knew the vow, the law of the land. And that night, when the midwife came to take the child away, Umenka closed the door and said no word. He hid his son, deep within the chambers of his compound, beyond the yam barns and oil pots, behind a carved wall where no servant dared to tread. Each night, Adaku would sneak in to nurse the boy, wrapping his cries with layers of cloth so the neighbors would not hear. But the eyes of Olu-Udo were many. No secret was ever truly safe. Soon rumors began to swell, that Umenka's compound burned lamps long after midnight, and that the cries of an unseen child echoed through his courtyard. When word reached the palace, the king's face grew dark. He said nothing, but his sleep left him. Each night he dreamed of the river, of the same stone he once prayed to, and the same voice whispering, "You cannot cheat a promise." At dawn, the king called his chiefs together beneath the sacred tree. His hands trembled as he spoke. "The land is cracking beneath our feet. The hearts of men have turned to deceit. The gods will not be mocked. If a man hides what belongs to them, we shall all perish." But the people were no longer afraid. They had lost too much to believe. Mothers began to shout from the crowd, calling him a murderer, calling the gods cruel. They said, "If peace must drink the blood of our children, then let peace die with them." Fathers threw their hoes to the ground. Young men pounded on the palace gates, shouting for the king to speak the truth. And among them, Umenka stood silent, his eyes lowered, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. That night, a tremor ran through the land. The animals grew restless. The wells bubbled with mud. And in the center of the market, the very stone that marked Olu-Udo's founding split in two. The crack ran deep, glowing faintly as if something inside the earth had awakened. Women fell to their knees. The elders beat their chests. And the old priest murmured, the vow is breathing again. Above the kingdom, thunder rolled, though no rain fell. And for the first time in many generations, the king felt truly afraid. Not of the gods, not of his people, but of the promise he himself could no longer control. The rain stopped. The wind forgot its path. The sun burned longer than it ever had. In Olu-Udo, the rivers had turned to dust, and even the frogs were silent. Famine walked through the land like a shadow that refused to leave. Traders stopped coming from Onitsha. The ports that once echoed with laughter now echoed with hollow footsteps and hungry sighs. Palm trees refused to yield. The yam barns emptied faster than they could be filled. Children sat by dry streams, tracing circles in the sand where water once ran. The scent of decay floated through the air, and with every dawn, another mother wailed. The king's palace was no longer a place of gold and song. Its courtyards were empty, its pillars cracked, its drums long silent. His wives had fled to their father's lands, and his chiefs, once his brothers, now gathered in secret corners, whispering that the gods had abandoned him. But the truth was simpler. The gods had not left him. He had left himself. Each night, the old king, Eze Obieze, sat alone beside the broken stone at the heart of the market square. The stone that had once promised peace now glowed faintly in the moonlight, like a wound that refused to heal. He would place his hand upon it and speak softly, as though it were alive. A man who swears by the river should not fear the flood, yet when the tide turns, who shall he blame? His voice would tremble, breaking like dry leaves underfoot. He remembered the years of wandering, how his people suffered, how hunger tore them apart, how death walked beside them until he made that fateful vow. He had promised what was not his, the lives of children unborn, and now the earth itself demanded payment. In the outer villages, rebellion brewed. Fathers sharpened their machetes. Some said, "Let the king's blood replace the blood of our sons." Others whispered that killing him would bring a curse deeper than the one they already bore. But that night, no one dared approach the market square. The sky was heavy, the air thick with something unseen. The king knelt before the stone once more, his wrapper soaked with sweat, his eyes clouded by sorrow. He raised his hands and cried out, "O Kwai, stone of my fathers, you gave us rest and took our laughter. If I must pay, let it be tonight." Then thunder answered. A single bolt tore through the sky and struck the market square. The light was so fierce that the villagers saw it from miles away. Those who ran to the scene found the ground trembling, the air smelling of rain and ash. When dawn came, the market was silent. There before the cracked stone lay the body of the king, his crown turned to dust, his mouth filled with sand, and his hands still gripping the relic that had once saved them. They buried him beneath the sacred Iroko tree and covered the stone with earth. Some said the storm had carried his soul into the clouds. Others whispered that his spirit had entered the stone, that it still watched, still listened. Years passed. The famine ended. The land slowly healed, and the people began to rebuild. But they never spoke of the vow again. But even in peace, the shadow of that promise lingered. It was said that on certain nights, when the wind rolled through the valley and the moon hung red in the sky, the cries of unseen children could be heard near the old market. Faint, distant, but undescribably real. And so the
tale ends, but its echo still dances in the wind. Remember, child, the moon never forgets the stories whispered beneath her light. You've been listening to Moonlight Tales of Africa. If your heart has felt the fire tonight, let it glow. Like, share, and come again when the moon calls.